The ranch was 3 months from bankruptcy. The kitchen smelled like surrender. 16 men had forgotten how to laugh. And one woman had exactly 3 hours, to prove she was worth keeping around. What she cooked that night wasn't just a meal, it was a dare, a declaration, a desperate act of stubborn hope from a woman with nothing left to lose and everything left to give. Here on this channel, we tell the stories the West never forgot, of dust and grit and grace, of cowboys who die for the brand, of women who held everything together with flour-dusted hands, and of love that grows deepest in the hardest ground. What this story teaches us, sometimes it only takes one meal, one act of genuine care, to remind broken people that they are still worth fighting for. Don't scroll past this one. Like it, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. Because every week we bring you another story just like this one, made for hearts that still believe in people.
Clara had seen her share of rough kitchens, but this one was pretty near the bottom of the barrel. The whole place smelled of failure, a mix of burnt coffee, spoiled grease, and that sorry scent of men who had just plain stopped expecting anything better from life. A crust of old flour covered nearly every surface. The stovetop looked like it hadn't seen a good cleaning since the big war. Rusted pots and pans hung from hooks, their handles eaten through. She found a single clean patch of floor for her traveling bag and immediately rolled up her sleeves. "Ma'am, if I was you, I wouldn't go near that sink." The voice belonged to a young cowpoke leaning on the doorframe. He couldn't have been more than 20, with eyes that had seen too much sun and not enough kindness. The elbows on his shirt were both patched. "What's your name?" Clara asked, her eyes still fixed on the counter. She was wrestling with a wet rag. "Tommy Birch, ma'am." "Well, Tommy Birch, you can either pitch in and help or you can get out of my way." He didn't budge. "The boss man said you've got 3 hours. The fellas are already taking bets on you." "Let 'em bet," Clara said. She found a bucket, worked the hand pump, and started hauling water. "I've had folks bet against me before." Tommy shifted his feet. "You truly believe you can whip up a meal in this pigsty that'll make Ethan Calloway ask you to stay?" She finally stopped and looked right at him. "Son, I'm not trying to stay. I'm trying to settle a debt." "For what? For pulling you out from under a busted wagon?" "For seeing that I was worth pulling out." That quieted him down right quick. Clara had shown up at Red Hollow 3 hours after noon. She was looking for the quiet cowboy who had saved her hide outside Wichita Falls when a dust storm had rolled in and turned the day to blackest night. She'd been riding with a merchant wagon, not really headed anywhere special, when the wind struck like a punch from the heavens. The wagon flipped clean over. The driver took off running. She was trapped under a wheel, swallowing dust, when a pair of strong hands lifted the crushing weight off her. By the time she caught her breath, the man was gone. The merchant told her later, "That there was Ethan Calloway, owns the Red Hollow Ranch about 40 miles north of here. Lost his wife 3 years ago, don't say much. And he sure don't stick around for a thank you." Clara spent the next week asking about him in every little town between Wichita Falls and the Red River. Everybody said the same thing. Calloway was a hard man, but he was fair. The ranch was on its last legs. No cook ever stayed more than a few days. Folks said the place had a darkness hanging over it, like some kind of bad luck charm. She didn't give a lick about bad luck charms. She cared about what she owed. When she finally walked up that ranch house lane covered in mud and worn to the bone, Ethan was mending a fence post. He stared at her, trying to place her face. "You pulled me out from under a wagon," she'd said, 5 nights back, during that storm near Wichita Falls. He slammed the post with his hammer 2 more times. "That was you. I came to pay you back. I don't need paying back." "Well, I do." That's when he finally stopped and gave her a real look. His eyes were the color of the sky right before a bad winter storm, cold and far away. "You got any money?" "No." "Then you ain't got nothing I need." Clara pulled her shoulders back. I can cook. Let me fix supper just one time. If your men won't eat it, I'll be gone before the sun comes up. But I'm settling my account, Mr. Calloway, one way or another. But he just watched her for a long minute, and she saw a little something flicker in his eyes. It wasn't hope, not really. It was more like he was curious about what kind of crazy woman would walk for 5 days just to cook a meal for a bunch of strangers. 3 hours, he finally said. Supper's at 6. If the boys spit it out, you walk. So there she was now, standing in his train wreck of a kitchen, with Tommy Birch staring at her like she'd just grown a second head. "You're really going to cook in here?" Tommy asked again. "First, I'm going to clean. Then I'm going to cook. Are you going to help me or just stand there and pass judgment?" He finally pushed himself off the doorframe. "What do you need?" "Hot water, and plenty of it. And go find me the oldest hand on this ranch. Somebody who can remember what used to be in this kitchen before it all went south." A little grin appeared on Tommy's face. "That'd be old Charlie Moss. He's been here since before Ethan's father passed on. Go get him." While Tommy took off, Clara looked over her battlefield. She had 3 short hours to work a miracle with food she hadn't even laid eyes on yet, using pots and pans that looked like they could give a person lockjaw. Most women would have turned right around and walked away. But Clara Whitmore had never been one for walking away, and she wasn't about to start now. She went after the stove first, scraping thick layers of old grease into a bucket until her hands were raw. She just kept on working. Charlie Moss shuffled in, smelling of horse and chewing tobacco. He squinted at her like he wasn't sure she was real. "Tommy said you was asking about the old pantry stock," he said, his voice scratchy like rocks in a tin can. "I need to know what you've got. What's fit to eat and what's been forgotten." Charlie rubbed his beard. "Well, now, there's dried peaches up in the attic. Mrs. Calloway, the first one, I mean. Ethan's mama. She used to put 'em up there. They're probably still fine if the mice haven't gotten to 'em. What else? The root cellar ought to have potatoes, carrots, and onions, if they ain't all turned to mush. Smokehouse has got some beef bones. The boys these days don't mess with bones. They just want the steak. Flour bin's fresh. We got a new sack last week. There's buttermilk in the spring house, but it's likely gone sour." Clara wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. "That buttermilk better be good. I'm going to need it." Charlie's eyes narrowed just a bit. "You aiming to make fried chicken?" "If I can get this stove hot enough and find some grease that ain't gone bad." A new look came over the old cowboy's face. "Lord have mercy, we ain't had decent fried chicken since—" He just let the words hang in the air. "Since when?" she asked gently. "Since Ethan's wife passed on. She used to make it every Sunday. The whole ranch would smell like glory." Clara looked him square in the eye. "Then let's make it smell like glory again." Charlie left and came back with another ranch hand, a younger man from Mexico with careful hands and watchful eyes. "This here is Miguel. He's the best man we got with a fire. He'll get that stove of yours burning right." Miguel just gave a single nod. "Senora." "Clara. Just call me Clara." In less than 30 minutes, that kitchen was buzzing like a beehive. Miguel coaxed the old stove back to life with a steady, roaring fire. Tommy hauled buckets of water until his shirt was soaked clean through. Charlie came down from the attic holding 2 dusty jars of dried peaches that were still perfectly good. Another fella, who didn't bother to give his name, brought up a basket of vegetables from the root cellar. Clara moved like a whirlwind. She checked the buttermilk. It was still good. She set it aside with a good shake of black pepper and salt to brine the chicken. She sifted the flour, found a sack of cornmeal, and started mixing up a batter for cornbread. She sent Tommy out to the smokehouse for every last beef bone he could find. "And don't you come back without at least a dozen of 'em," she called after him. "What are we doing, feeding an army?" Tommy hollered back. "No, we're feeding hungry men. There's a big difference." As the bones started to roast and release their flavor, Clara chopped up potatoes and carrots with a knife she had to sharpen herself on a worn-out whetstone. The steel sang against the stone. Her hands fell into a rhythm they knew from 100 other kitchens, from 100 other lives she'd lived before this one. She didn't need to tell these cowboys she'd cooked in lumber camps and dusty mining towns. She didn't need to say she'd fed men building railroads and wrangling cattle from Montana all the way down to Mexico. Food was the one language she spoke that everybody understood. You don't have to tell men your life story. You just have to feed them right. The chicken pieces went into the buttermilk. She coated each one in seasoned flour, with plenty of black pepper, salt, and just a touch of cayenne pepper. The lard in the big skillet popped and sizzled when the first piece hit, and a smell started to fill the kitchen that was like a prayer being answered. Charlie Moss stopped dead in the doorway and just took a deep breath. "Sweet heaven," he whispered. Miguel quietly made the sign of the cross. Tommy just stood there, mesmerized. "It smells like... I don't even know what that is." "It smells like someone gives a damn," Clara said, turning the chicken with a pair of tongs she'd dug out from under a pile of old rags. "Now all of you get out of my kitchen before you drip sweat in my supper." They scattered like quail. She worked by herself after that, which is how she liked it best. The cornbread went into a sizzling cast-iron skillet, its edges crisping up right away. The beef bones simmered away in a pot big enough to wash a toddler in, slowly giving up all their goodness. She added onions and carrots, potatoes, salt and pepper, and a bay leaf she found in a dusty old jar. The peach cobbler came last. She soaked the dried fruit in hot water to plump it up, then stirred in sugar, cinnamon, and butter. She rolled out a biscuit dough for the top, her hands working on their own, guided by pure instinct. The sun was low in the sky when the kitchen door swung open. It was Ethan Calloway, and behind him she could see all 16 of his men gathered and waiting like a posse. He looked all around the room, which now looked and smelled like a real kitchen again. The kitchen was a whole new world with clean counters and shelves in good order. Pots were bubbling on the stove, each with a job to do. His face was a stone mask, but a flicker of something changed in his eyes. "You had 3 hours," he stated, "and I put them to good use. The boys are hungry. Then we ought to feed them." Clara had already set the long table in the ranch dining room. She used plates she had found and washed, forks she had polished, and cups she had scrubbed clean. There were no fancy centerpieces or flowers, just spotless dishes and food that smelled like somebody's home. The cowboys ambled in, quiet and full of suspicion. They took their seats like men who thought they might be getting poisoned. Clara brought out the chicken first. It was golden brown, crispy, and still sizzling from the skillet. Next came the cornbread, with honey she had discovered in the pantry, drizzling down its sides. The beef stew was in a bowl big enough to serve a whole army. A peach cobbler sat waiting on the sideboard. Not a soul said a word. Nobody even budged. Ethan Calloway was at the head of the table, his expression impossible to read. He eyed that chicken like it was about to bite him. He looked at Clara like she had just performed some kind of dark magic. "Well," she said, "it is not going to hop on the plate for you." Charlie Moss was the first to reach for the chicken, his hand shaking just a little. He took a piece, sank his teeth into it, and his eyes fluttered shut. "Sweet Lord," he whispered. And that opened the floodgates. 16 men fell on that food like they had not eaten in a month of Sundays. The chicken was gone in a flash. The cornbread vanished in huge handfuls. The stew pot emptied so quick, Clara hardly had a moment to bring the refill from the kitchen. All this time, Ethan had not even picked up his fork. Clara walked over to stand right beside his chair. "You said if the men did not like it, I would be on my way." Well, he finally grabbed his fork and cut into a piece of chicken. The crispy skin made a crackling sound. The meat underneath was snow white and tender with steam rising from it. He took a bite. The whole room fell silent again, holding its breath. Ethan chewed for a long time, swallowed, and put his fork down. Then he picked it right back up and took a second bite. "Eat," he told the men, his voice all gravel. And for the first time in 3 long years, Red Hollow Ranch heard a sound it had long forgotten. Laughter! Tommy told a story about a horse that made folks chuckle. Miguel started a friendly argument with Charlie over the right way to fix a fence. Another cowboy, whose name Clara learned was Pete, asked for another helping, and then a third. When the cobbler was served, grown men squabbled over the very last spoonful like a bunch of kids. Clara just stood in the kitchen doorway, taking it all in. This right here was why she loved to cook. It was not about the food itself, but for this exact moment. The moment when folks remembered they were more than just bodies needing to be filled. When a dinner table turned into a place for fellowship instead of just a feeding trough. When a ranch house began to feel like a real home again. Ethan found her standing there after the men had shuffled out, their bellies full and their spirits high. "You can stay," he said, plain and simple. Clara just shook her head. "I said 1 meal. I said I would work off my debt, and now it is paid. I will be leaving in the morning." He took a step toward her, and she could smell the scent of horse and leather, and something else, too. A deep sadness that had soaked right into him like old rainwater. "What if I offered you a position? I am not looking for a job." "What are you looking for, then?" She looked him square in the eye. Those eyes like a winter sky holding way too much sorrow and not nearly enough hope. "I am just looking for the next place that needs a little help. That is all I have ever done. This place needs you. For how long? A week? Maybe 2? I have seen this show before, Mr. Calloway. Men get all excited about a good meal. Then they get used to it. Then they start making demands, and then they turn mean. I have been chased off of more ranches than you have got heads of cattle. Not from this one, you cannot know that. I know those men have not laughed like that in 3 years. I know Charlie Moss just told me he would pack his bags if you leave. I know 16 tough-as-nails ranch hands just ate peach cobbler and asked for the recipe like they were going to write a letter home to their mamas. He took a breath. I know I just tasted something that reminded me I was still drawing breath. A lump formed in Clara's throat. That is just food. It is not some kind of miracle. Maybe not, he said, but it is something. And something is a whole lot more than what we have had around here. She wanted to fight him on it, wanted to say she had heard all those promises before. From ranch foremen and camp cooks and wagon masters who swore she was the best thing since sliced bread, right up until the day they decided she was not. But the look on Ethan Calloway's face gave her pause. It was not pleading, and it was not a trick. It was just a simple, honest need. 1 week, she heard herself say, "I will stay for 1 week. If it works out, we can talk more. If it does not, then I am gone. And you will not owe me a single thing. Deal." They shook on it. His hand was calloused and strong. Hers was dusted with flour and marked with little scars from a life spent around hot stoves. At that moment, neither one of them had any idea that their handshake was the start of something that neither was prepared for. Something that would push them both in ways that a good meal could not solve. Something that was already stirring in the shadows outside the ranch house, just biding its time. But for tonight, in this quiet moment, with the smell of fried chicken still hanging in the air and the low rumble of happy men drifting through the walls, Clara Whitmore let herself hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place that would not be so quick to cast her aside. Even if it was just for a week, even if she was only fooling herself, and even if the real trouble was yet to come, the rooster had not even thought about crowing when Clara heard the sound of boots on the porch. She had been awake since 4 o'clock, getting the kitchen fire going, measuring out coffee, and wondering if she had ever been this keyed up about making breakfast. Through the window, she could see shadows moving over in the bunkhouse. Men were starting to stir, getting ready for a day's work that began long before the sun had any right to be up. The door swung open without a knock. Ethan was standing there, holding his hat in his hands, looking for all the world like he had not slept a wink. "Did not figure you would be up this early. The ranch has to eat, so do you." He placed something on the counter. It was a tin of real coffee, the good kind all the way from New Orleans. "I figured you could use this." Clara just stared at the tin. "Where did you get this?" "I had it put away." Today seemed like the right time to bring it out. You hiding anything else I ought to know about? Plenty. But this coffee is a start. He started to walk away, but then he stopped. The men are going to be expecting the same kind of meal you gave them yesterday, just so you are aware. I cannot be frying chicken every morning, Mr. Calloway. The name is Ethan. And I am not asking you to. I am just giving you a warning. You have set a high bar. He was gone before she could think of a reply. Clara opened the tin and took a deep breath of that real coffee, not the burnt chicory stuff most ranches tried to pass off. Her hands shook just a tiny bit as she measured it out. 1 meal down, 20 more to go until the week was over. No pressure at all. By the time the sun finally peeked over the horizon, she had biscuits rising in the oven, bacon sizzling in the pan, eggs scrambled with some cheese she found wrapped in a cloth in the icebox, gravy bubbling on the stovetop, and coffee strong enough to raise the dead. The cowboys came in one after another. First came the early birds, then the ones who liked to sleep in, and then came Charlie Moss, moving slower than molasses in winter, but grinning like it was Christmas Day. "Smells just like my mama's kitchen," he announced to the room. Tommy Birch gave him a little nudge. "Your mama could not cook to save her life, and you know it. She could in my memory, and that is what matters." The dining room was a lot louder today. The men seemed more at ease with each other. Clara brought out the big platters and watched them go at it with the kind of intense focus that men save for things they worry might just disappear. Miguel looked over at her and gave her a single nod. "Muy bueno, señora. Muy. You better save your compliments until after you have tried it." "I do not need to try it." I can tell by the way Charlie's eyes got all misty. "I did not," Charlie mumbled through a big bite of biscuit. "You did too. I saw you wipe your face. That was just bacon grease. You lying Mexican. Both of you just shut your traps and eat," Pete hollered from down at the end of the table. Clara slipped back into the kitchen, her heart thumping a whole lot harder than it should have been. 2 meals. That is all she had made for them. Just 2 meals. And these fellas were already acting like she had been there for years instead of just a day. It ought to have felt good. But instead, it just felt dangerous. She had learned the hard way that the higher folks lift you up, the harder you fall when you let them down. And sooner or later, she always let them down. The breakfast plates came back to the kitchen wiped clean. Tommy hung around while she was washing up the dishes. "You need any help? You have got cattle to look after, do you not?" "Yeah, but then you had better go look after them. I can handle this." He shifted from one foot to the other, twisting his hat in his hands. "Some of the boys are making bets." Clara's hands froze in the soapy water. "About what? On how long you're going to stick around? Most are saying a week, maybe 2. A few of them think you will be gone by Friday." He paused. "I put my money on you staying." Do not bet with money you cannot afford to part with. Tommy was not betting with money. "I bet my Sunday off next month. That is a fool's bet." "Maybe so, but I figure you are tougher than how you look." He started for the door, then paused and looked back. "And keep an eye on Frank Delaney. He is the big fella with a scar on his cheek. He has been here longer than anyone but Charlie, and he is not real fond of new ways." I made a mental note. After Tommy left, Clara stood all by herself in the kitchen with soap suds dripping from her hands. Frank Delaney. She remembered seeing him at breakfast. He was sitting off by himself, eating his food without a word, just watching her like a fox eyeing the chicken coop. He was a large man, maybe 40 years old, with a deep-seated anger in his eyes that did not seem to need a reason to boil over. She had crossed paths with men like Frank before. They were always the root of the trouble. By noon, Clara had scrubbed the kitchen clean from top to bottom all over again, taken a proper inventory of the pantry, and learned that Red Hollow Ranch was just 3 weeks from being out of flour. They had no sugar at all and were down to their last jar of vegetables, canned 2 summers back by whoever was here then. She found Ethan in the barn, shoeing a horse. "We are in need of supplies," she said, getting straight to the point. He did not bother to look up. "Town is 20 miles south. We make a supply run every 2 weeks. The last one was last week. Then you all must have gone to the wrong stores. Or you did not purchase enough, or someone has been helping themselves to it." Now that made him look up. "Nobody takes what is not theirs on this ranch. Then tell me how you are nearly out of the basics with 16 mouths to feed. Ethan gently placed the horse's hoof down and stood up straight, wiping the sweat from his brow. We get by with what we have on hand. You cannot get by with empty flour sacks, Ethan. I will take care of it. When is that going to be? Because dinner is in 6 hours, and I'm already cutting the portions down. I said I will take care of it. Clara stepped in closer, so near she could smell the horse, the hot metal, and the frustration rolling off him. You hired me to cook. I cannot make a meal out of thin air. You either give me money for supplies or you admit this whole ranch is going under. The quiet between them stretched out tight like a strand of barbed wire. We are not going under, Ethan said at last. We are just running lean. There is a big difference. There is a... How lean? Lean enough that I cannot pull any men for a supply trip until Saturday. That is 4 days away. I know how to count days. And do you know how to feed 16 grown men who are hungry on nothing but wishful thinking and old coffee grounds? Ethan clenched his jaw. You told me you would stay for a week. I reckon we will see if you are a woman of your word. He went back to the horse, acting like she was not even there. Clara had the urge to fight back, to tell him she was not a miracle worker, that a cook needed ingredients, that his foolish pride was about to leave his men hungry. But she just turned and walked back to the kitchen to figure something out. Dinner that evening was beef bone soup again, served with the very last of the good bread. The men ate it and did not complain, but she could feel their disappointment in the air, thick as the humidity right before a thunderstorm. Frank Delaney decided to speak for the very first time. This is the same soup we had last night. Clara looked him square in the eye. Same bones, but different vegetables. Is there a problem? It just seems a cook who talks so big about paying off her debts would offer up a little more variety. A cook with supplies offers variety. A cook working with nothing but scraps has to make do. Maybe you are not as skilled as you claim to be. The whole table fell silent. Charlie Moss cleared his throat nervously. Frank, that is about enough. Is it? We all got our hopes up for some fried chicken and maybe a cobbler. Instead, we are eating bone soup like we are as poor as church mice. Frank shoved his bowl aside. I have eaten better food on cattle drives. Then maybe you ought to go join one, Clara said, her voice dangerously quiet. Maybe I will. Maybe we all ought to before we all waste away waiting on miracles that are not coming. Ethan's voice sliced through the thick tension like a sharp knife. You got a problem with me, Frank? Then you say it to my face. Do not take it out on the cook. Frank stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. I am just saying what every man here is thinking, boss. You brought in some woman to solve problems that food cannot fix. This ranch is dying. It has been since Mrs. Calloway passed away. Bringing in strays is not going to change a thing. Sit down. I am through with sitting. Frank stormed out, slamming the door so hard it made the windows shake. No one moved. No one said a word. Clara could feel her cheeks burning with shame. I will be gone in the morning. You will do nothing of the sort, Ethan stated. He is right. I cannot fix this with cooking. He is just mad. Mad men say foolish things. Ethan looked at each man around the table. Does anyone else want to head out? The door is right there, but Clara is staying for the week we agreed on. What she does after that is up to her. One after another, the men returned to their soup, but the peaceful dinner was ruined. Clara went back into the kitchen and held onto the counter, fighting back tears that she refused to let anyone see. This was the reason she never put down roots. This was why she was always on the move. Because in the end, they always turned on you. They always found a way to blame you for troubles that were there long before you ever showed up. He's just scared. She spun around and saw Miguel standing in the doorway. Frank, he went on, he is scared this ranch is going to fail, scared he will lose the only home he has had for 15 years, scared that if we cannot buy food, we sure cannot afford to keep him on. That does not give him the right to act that way. No, but being scared can make a man mean. You know how that is. And Clara did know. She had seen it in dusty mining camps and rough logging towns, in kitchens all the way from here to Montana. Fear and an empty stomach could turn any man cruel. "I do not have enough food to get us to Saturday," she admitted in a quiet voice. "Then we will make what we have last." "How?" Miguel gave a small smile. "You are not the only one who knows how to stretch out a meal, señora. My abuela could feed 12 people with just 3 potatoes and a prayer. I will show you." For the next 3 hours, Miguel showed Clara the old ways his grandmother had used back in Sonora. He taught her how to render every last bit of fat, to soak dried beans overnight so they would double in size, to make flour last longer by mixing it with cornmeal, and to turn vegetable peels into a rich stock. They worked together in a comfortable quiet, and Clara felt a small change happening inside her. Maybe she was not completely on her own in this mess after all. Thursday's breakfast was simple cornmeal mush with the last bit of honey. The men ate it all without a word of complaint. Lunch was a bean soup so thick you could stand a spoon up in it. Dinner was potato hash with tiny pieces of bacon, so small they were more of a memory than a meal. With every meal she served, Clara braced herself for a rebellion. But instead, the men just ate. And on Friday morning, when she served fried mush with some sorghum syrup Tommy had discovered in the back of the pantry, Charlie Moss told a story about his mother making the very same thing during the war. "We ate that every day for 2 months," he said. "I thought I would never be able to look at it again. But this," he said, taking another bite, "this tastes like she is right here with me." Frank Delaney never came to any of the meals. Clara did not ask where he had been. Friday night, Ethan found her in the kitchen long after everyone else was asleep. "Supply run is tomorrow morning," he told her. "I am taking the wagon into town. I will need a list." Clara handed him 3 pages filled with carefully written items, including quantities and what she figured they would cost. He just stared at the sheets of paper. "This is mighty detailed. That is my job. Most cooks just shout out what they are missing. I am not most cooks." He folded the pages and slipped them into his pocket. "Frank owes you an apology. Frank does not owe me a thing. He was right about one thing. I cannot save this ranch with food. But you still fed us. For 5 days you fed us on nothing." Ethan leaned back against the counter. "Do you have any idea what that takes?" "Desperation, a lot of skill, and something more." He stopped for a moment. "My wife always used to say that cooking was the only truly honest work left in this world. You could not fake it. You could not pretend. The food either nourished you, or it did not." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. "She sounds like she was a very smart woman." "She was smart enough to marry me when I had absolutely nothing but this ranch and a big dream." He looked around the kitchen. "She passed away in this very room. A fever took her in just 3 days. I was powerless to save her. I could not do a single thing but sit and watch her slip away from me. I am so sorry. Do not be. Just try to understand why this kitchen stayed dark for so long, why I just let it fall apart. Because every time I set foot in here, I had to watch her die all over again." He looked directly into Clara's eyes. "Until you came along. Now when I walk in here, I smell food cooking. I can hear men eating. I feel like maybe this place is not just some tomb I have been looking after." Clara was at a loss for words. Ethan pushed himself off the counter. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow we get a fresh start." He walked out, and Clara was left standing in the kitchen that had once belonged to a dead woman, feeling the pressure of hopes she had never wanted. She had only promised them 1 week. That week was nearly done, and she had no earthly idea what she would do next. Saturday morning came with a bitter cold, the kind that bites at you and warns of bad weather on its way. Ethan hitched up the wagon before the sun was even up, and Clara watched him from the kitchen window as he loaded empty sacks and lockboxes. Tommy came and stood beside her. "The boss is taking Frank with him. Why would he do that?" "Because Frank needs to see for himself how bad things really are, how much money we are spending just to stay afloat." Tommy's voice got lower. "This ranch is in trouble, Clara, real trouble. Ethan will never admit it, but we all know this could be our very last season if things do not get better soon. A heavy feeling settled in Clara's stomach. Last season? The prices for cattle are way down. The cost of feed is sky high. We lost half our herd last winter during that terrible cold snap. The bank is starting to circle like a vulture. And Ethan, Tommy's voice trailed off. What about Ethan? He is too proud to ever ask for help, too stubborn to think about selling. And he is too loyal to let any of us go, even when he can barely afford to keep us. Tommy looked right at her. You staying here might be the only good thing that has happened to this place in 3 years. Do not let it go to waste. He was gone before she could say anything back. Clara spent that morning getting ready for their return, cleaning and organizing, and planning out meals that would make the new supplies last as long as they possibly could. She was up to her elbows in sourdough starter when Charlie Moss came rushing through the door. There is a storm coming, he said, out of breath. A big one. The radio is saying it will be here by nightfall, but it is only October. You can tell that to the sky. Clara looked out the window. The horizon had turned into a dark line. Ominous purple and black clouds were rolling in fast like an army on the march. Where is Ethan? Still in town. He ought to be. Be back by 3. Charlie glanced at his pocket watch. It was noon already. He worried that if the storm rolled in early, they might not make it. By 2 o'clock, the air turned bitter, dropping a full 20 degrees. Around 2:30, the first snowflakes began to drift down. They were big, wet, heavy flakes, the kind that meant trouble. The cowboys huddled in the dining room, their eyes fixed on the windows and the empty road. 3 o'clock came, and then it was gone. Still no sign of the wagon. At 3:30, Miguel made the sign of the cross, whispering prayers under his breath in Spanish. By 4 o'clock, the snow fell so thick that Clara couldn't even see the barn from the house. Pete finally said what was on everyone's mind. They ought to have been back by now. Charlie tried to sound hopeful, saying, "The road's probably slow." But his voice didn't carry much hope. At 4:30, Tommy shot to his feet. "I'm going out to find him." Clara heard her own voice cut through the tension. "You'll freeze solid out there," he shot back. "That's better than just sitting here while the boss dies." She replied firmly, "Nobody is dying. Not while I can help it." Her hands, however, were trembling. She moved toward the stove and began to work. She heated broth, wrapped fresh bread in cloth, and filled thermoses with coffee hot enough to scald. Her hands knew the motions, even as her mind was screaming with fear. "What are you doing?" Miguel asked her. She answered with a steady voice, "I'm making sure they have something warm when they get here." Her tone was firm, using the word when, not if. At 5 o'clock, as darkness settled in and the storm howled like a wild animal, they finally heard it. The sound of wagon wheels groaning, horses neighing in panic, and men shouting. Everyone bolted for the door. The wagon came skidding into the yard at an angle, one of its wheels completely busted, and supplies were tumbling out into the deep snow. Ethan was slumped on the driver's bench, his beard crusted with ice, his hands frozen tight to the reins. Frank Delaney was dangling off the side, his face covered in blood, and one arm hanging at a sickening angle. Tommy and Miguel charged out into the blizzard. Clara snatched the thermoses and ran right behind them. The cold slammed into her like a punch, knocking the wind from her lungs, but she kept moving forward. She reached the wagon and pushed a thermos into Ethan's frozen hands. "Drink," she ordered. "Frank, I see him. You drink first, then you can help." Ethan's hands were so numb with cold he couldn't even twist the lid open. Clara did it for him and held it to his lips. He took a sip, coughed, and then drank more. Through chattering teeth, he explained, "The wheel broke about 5 miles back." He said that Frank had jumped down to see if he could fix it. A horse got spooked and kicked him. His arm was broken, and maybe some ribs, too. They managed to get Frank inside and settled both men near the warmth of the fire. Clara went into action, her movements swift and sure. She brought hot water and clean cloths. Miguel held Frank down while she set his arm, using torn strips from a bedsheet since they had no proper splints. Frank cried out once, a sharp sound of pain, and then fainted. Good, Clara muttered to herself. This will be easier now. She carefully wrapped his ribs, cleaned the gash on his head, and listened to make sure his breathing was steady. After that, she turned her attention to Ethan, who was sitting by the fire, shaking uncontrollably. Take off your coat, she told him. He protested. I'm fine, she replied. You have hypothermia. Now either you take that coat off or I'll cut it off you. He was too cold and exhausted to put up a fight. She stripped him down to his undershirt, wrapped him in heavy blankets, and made him drink more of the hot coffee. His lips had a bluish tint. His hands would not stop shaking. He mumbled something about the supplies. To hell with the supplies, she said. You nearly died. He managed a weak response. Got most of it. The cowboys had already started dragging the sacks inside. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, beans, rice, dried meat, and lard. Everything from her list was there, and even a few extras. Clara felt hot tears sting her eyes. He had almost died just to bring her groceries. You're a fool, she whispered. Yeah, Ethan agreed, his teeth still chattering. But you got what you needed. It was in that moment she realized this was no longer just a job for her. It wasn't about paying off a debt anymore. This was something different, something that scared her more than any storm ever could. The blizzard raged on for 3 days without a break. Clara found herself sleeping in a chair by the fire, keeping a watchful eye on Frank Delaney's breathing and Ethan Calloway's shivering form buried under a pile of blankets that never seemed to get him warm enough. She had sent the other men to the bunkhouse with strict orders to stay put and keep warm, but she couldn't bring herself to leave these 2 men. She just wouldn't. On the second morning, Frank's temperature shot up. It's his ribs, Miguel said as he checked the bandages. It could be an infection starting, or it might just be his body reacting to the injury, Clara said, pressing a cool, damp cloth to Frank's forehead. Either way, we need to keep him comfortable and watch him like a hawk. Miguel urged her. You should get some sleep, Senora. She shook her head. I will sleep when they are both out of the woods. After Miguel left, Clara was alone with 2 men, both barely conscious, in a storm that refused to end. She boiled water and changed their bandages, and when Frank was awake enough to swallow, she carefully spooned broth between his lips. Ethan would wake up from time to time, confused and talking about cattle and fences, things that didn't matter until he could stand on his own 2 feet again. Shh, Clara would soothe him, gently pushing him back down. You need to rest. He would argue, can't rest, there's work to be done. She would always reply, the work can wait, you can't. On the 3rd day, Frank woke up with clear eyes, fully aware of his surroundings. His voice was as rough as gravel when he said, You're still here. Where else would I go, she replied. He admitted, I thought for sure I had run you off. Clara dipped a cloth in cool water and wrung it out. You certainly tried, she said. He winced as he tried to move. I said some terrible things. You didn't deserve any of that. She agreed. No, I did not. Are you going to make me beg you to forgive me? He asked. She looked at him. I'm going to make you heal so you can get back to your duties. This ranch needs you. Frank's eyes started to water. It's been a long time since anybody said something like that to me. Then the people around here are fools, Clara said as she adjusted his blankets. You've been here for 15 years. Charlie told me that kind of loyalty is important. Loyalty doesn't pay the bills, he said. No, she agreed, but it builds something that money can never buy. Frank looked at her face for a long moment. Are you really planning on staying? Your week is already up. She gave a small smile. I suppose I missed my ride out, so yes. Good, he said, and then he closed his eyes. Because I have a feeling you might be the one thing that can save us all. "I am just a cook, Frank," she said. "You can keep telling yourself that," he replied. When Ethan finally woke up for good, with no fever and no confusion, just clear-headed and present, he saw Clara asleep in the chair. Her head was tilted at an angle he knew would cause a crick in her neck when she woke. He got to his feet slowly, testing his legs, and then gently draped his own blanket over her shoulders. She didn't move. He stood there for a long time, just watching her sleep. He felt something inside his chest crack open, a part of him that had been sealed off for 3 long years. This woman had saved his life, but it was more than that. She had brought his ranch back from the brink with nothing more than some flour and a stubborn spirit. He had no idea what to do with that feeling. He didn't know what to do with the urge to brush the hair from her face, or the way his heart started to beat faster whenever she smiled, or how he had begun to listen for the sound of her voice coming from the kitchen, like it was the only sound in the world that mattered. "You are staring," Clara said, her eyes still closed. "I did not mean to wake you," Ethan said softly. "You did not. Your thinking woke me up. It is very loud." He was surprised. "I did not know my thoughts had a volume." She opened her eyes and looked right at him. A direct gaze just like the one she gave him that first night in the kitchen when she insisted he let her cook. "You are standing," she observed. "It appears so," he said. "How do you feel?" she asked. He considered it for a moment. "Like I was kicked by every single horse in the barn, and then left outside in a blizzard." He paused, then added, "But I feel alive, and that's because of you." "It was just coffee and blankets," she deflected. "It was because of you refusing to let me give up," he insisted, moving a little closer. "Why did you do it? You could have stayed safe inside. You could have let the men take care of it." "Because sometimes men do not handle things the right way," Clara said as she stood up, wincing as her neck complained. "And besides, I told you before, I always pay my debts." He looked at her. "You paid that debt 5 meals ago." "Well," she said, "then maybe I have a different reason for staying." "And what reason is that?" he asked. Clara met his gaze. "I have not quite figured that out yet." The storm finally broke on the 4th day. It left the ranch buried in snow that came all the way up to the fence posts. The men got to work digging paths to the barn, to the bunkhouse, and to the animals that had been huddled together trying to stay warm. They had lost 3 calves. 2 of the horses had come down with a breathing sickness. The chicken coop had collapsed under the heavy ice, but all the men were alive. The supplies were secure, and Clara's kitchen was a warm haven. In the days right after the storm, she seemed to be cooking all the time. She made hot meals to chase away the cold, sweet treats to raise everyone's spirits, and hearty dishes to help them regain their strength. The cowboys ate as if they had been starving for a lifetime instead of just a few days. Frank Delaney was the last one to make his way back to the dining table. He walked in slowly, his arm still in a sling and his ribs taped up tight, but he was moving on his own. The room fell silent as he came in. Frank stopped right in front of Clara. In a voice loud enough for every man to hear, he said, "I owe you an apology." And she replied, "You already apologized." "I did that when I was half out of my head with a fever," he said. "I'm doing it again now that I'm in my right mind." He took off his hat. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what you could do for this place. I was wrong in how I treated you. And for that, I am truly sorry." Clara put down the serving spoon she was holding. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "Just like that?" he asked. "What do you want, Frank, a pound of flesh?" "I want you to know that I mean it," he said. "And I want you to know that if any man on this ranch ever shows you disrespect from this day on, he will have to answer to me." The other cowboys shifted in their seats, nodding their heads in agreement. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. "I appreciate that," Frank continued. "You do more than just cook, ma'am. You are the glue that holds us all together, and that is worth more than any amount of gold." He then sat down, and the meal went on. But something had changed in the room, something important. Later that evening, Charlie Moss found Clara out on the porch, looking up at the stars that were starting to peek out from behind the clouds. "You handled that well with Frank," he said as he lit his pipe. "I did not do anything," she replied. "You forgave him," Charlie said. "That is not nothing." He puffed a cloud of smoke into the chilly air. "Do you know why he was so angry with you when you first arrived?" "Was it fear?" she guessed. Miguel mentioned that. "Yes, fear was part of it," he said. "But it was more than that. Frank lost his wife in the same year that Ethan lost his. The situations were different. Frank's wife ran off with a cattle buyer, but loss is still loss. When you showed up, cooking just like Sarah Calloway used to, bringing life back into this place, back to this place." His voice just faded out. It brought back everything he had lost, all the things he could never have again. Clara took that in. "I had no idea." "How could you have?" "Frank, we do not talk about it. None of us ever do. But this ranch is not just failing because of money troubles, Clara. It is failing because every soul here is mourning something. Ethan's wife, Frank's busted marriage, Tommy's father who drank himself into an early grave. Miguel's family way down in Mexico he cannot afford to go see. Pete's dreams of having his own spread one day." Charlie looked her right in the eye. "Even you are grieving something, are you not?" Clara's hands clutched the porch railing. "What on earth makes you say that?" "Because folks who run from one town to the next are usually running from something inside they just cannot face. I am not running." "Are you sure about that?" Clara gave him no answer. Charlie tapped his pipe on the rail, sending a little shower of ash to the ground. "Whatever it is you're running from, it followed you right here. Sooner or later, you have to turn around and look it in the eye. The only question is if you will do it by yourself or with folks who have come to care about you." He left her standing there with nothing but the stars and the hard truth for company. The next morning, Ethan found her in the pantry, rearranging the shelves. "Need something?" she asked, her back still to him. "I need to talk about our finances." That got her attention. She turned around, a smudge of flour on her hands. "What about them?" "The ranch's books. You deserve to know exactly where we are. I am just the cook. You are a whole lot more than that, and we both know it." Ethan took a worn ledger out from inside his coat. "This ranch is about 3 months away from going belly up. Maybe 4 if we can stretch things real thin. The bank wants the payment on a loan my father took out before he passed. I have been keeping up with the interest, but now they want the whole chunk. $15,000 by spring, or they take the land." Clara felt her stomach drop clear to her boots. 15,000. I've got about $3,000 saved up. The cattle will not bring in near enough. The cost of feed is just eating us alive. And now with all this storm damage, he snapped the ledger shut. "I am telling you this because if you are planning on staying, you ought to know what you are staying for. This whole operation might be a sinking ship. Why not just sell? To who? The ranch next door wants our land, but they will offer me pennies on the dollar. They will not pay enough to even clear the debt. I would lose everything and still be in the hole." Ethan's jaw tensed up. "And I cannot do that to my men. Some of them have been on this ranch for 20 years. This is their home too. So what is your plan?" "I do not rightly have one yet. Still working on it." Clara wiped her floury hands on her apron. "Let me help." "You are already helping. You are keeping us fed." "No, I mean with the money. I am good with numbers. I used to keep the books for a logging camp up in Oregon. Let me take a look at that ledger. See if maybe there is something you are missing." Ethan paused for a moment. "You do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to. I want to." She held her hand out. "Let me help you, Ethan." He handed the ledger over to her. Clara spent the next 2 days buried in 3 years of the ranch's finances, and what she discovered made her feel sick to her stomach. "You've been paying way too much for feed," she told Ethan on the 3rd morning. This supplier is charging you double what he should be. That is the only supplier within 50 miles. No, he is not. There is another one over in Abilene that will deliver for half the cost. I found their advertisement tucked inside an old newspaper in the pantry. Ethan just stared at the piece of paper. How in the world did I miss this? Because you were drowning. It is hard to see the shore when you can barely keep your head above water. Clara pointed her finger at another line in the book. And right here, you are paying property taxes on land you do not even own anymore. This section was sold 4 years ago according to the deed records, but you are still getting a bill for it. That is the county cheating you. That is money you can get back. Maybe $500. They worked all afternoon finding one mistake after another, overpayments, and chances that were missed. By the time evening came, Clara had found $1,200 in funds they could recover and figured out ways to cut their monthly expenses by 30%. This does not fix everything, she said, her voice rough with exhaustion. But it does buy us some time. Ethan looked at her like she had just performed some kind of miracle. Where did you learn to do all this? My father was an accountant before he drank himself to death. He taught me about numbers before he ever taught me my letters. Clara closed the ledger. Numbers do not lie, Ethan. People do. But the numbers always tell the truth. What else did he teach you? That men will take advantage of you if you let them. That trust has to be earned, not just handed over. That the only person you can truly count on is yourself. She paused for a moment. He was wrong about that last part, though, was he not? Yeah. Turns out sometimes you can count on a bunch of cowboys who bet on you and a stubborn rancher who almost gets himself killed bringing you flour. Ethan reached his hand across the table and took hers. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. Thank you, he said, his voice low and simple. For what? For seeing all the things I could not see. For caring about a place that is not even yours. For staying put when you could have just run away. His thumb gently brushed across her knuckles. For making me remember what hope feels like. Clara pulled her hand back, her heart hammering in her chest. Ethan, I know you are not looking for this. I am not either. But it is happening anyway. Nothing is happening. Is it not? He stood up from the table. I think about you when I am out riding the fence line. I wonder what you are cooking up. I find myself listening for the sound of your voice. I have not felt that in 3 years, Clara. I have not wanted to feel it. But here we are. Here we are, she echoed, not knowing what else there was to say. I am not asking you for anything, and I am not expecting anything. I just wanted you to know. He started for the door, then he stopped. And Clara, whatever it is you are running from, Charlie is right. Eventually you are going to have to face it. But when you do not have to face it all by yourself. He left, and Clara sat there in the empty kitchen, surrounded by account books and hard truths. She had come to Red Hollow to settle a debt. But somewhere along the way, she had started building something entirely different. Something that scared her more than going broke or getting caught in a blizzard or dealing with angry cowboys. It was something that felt dangerously like a home. The next Sunday, Clara woke up to an empty kitchen and a quiet house. She dressed in a hurry, completely confused, and walked outside to find all 16 cowboys gathered near the old chapel up on the hill. Ethan was standing at the front of the group, holding his hat in his hands. Clara walked toward them slowly. What is going on? She asked Tommy. The boss called a meeting, said it was important. Ethan waited until Clara had joined the group, then he began to speak. 3 years ago, I lost my wife in that house down there. I lost my faith right here in this chapel. I lost my will to fight for anything more than just getting by. His voice carried clearly across the snow. This ranch has been dying a slow death ever since. Not because of money, though that is surely part of it. It is because I gave up. I stopped leading. I stopped caring about anything except making it through one day to the next. The men shifted on their feet. uncomfortable with this much raw honesty. Then a woman showed up carrying nothing but a carpet bag and a kind of determination I could not understand. She cooked one meal and everything started to change. Not the ranch itself, but us. We changed. We started laughing again, eating our meals together and caring about more than just the day's work. Ethan looked right at Clara. She saved Frank's life, and she saved mine. She saved this ranch from going under by finding money I never even knew we had. And she did all of it while asking for nothing in return but a chance to pay off a debt that was already paid in full. Clara felt hot tears starting to well up in her eyes. "So here is what I am proposing," Ethan went on. "We stop dying. We start fighting. We fix the money problems. We fix the fences. We fix the broken parts of ourselves we have all been ignoring. And we do it together as a ranch that is worth saving." "How?" Frank called out from the back. "The bank still wants their $15,000 by spring. We will figure it out. But we will do it as a team. No more one man trying to carry the whole burden. No more giving up." Ethan's voice grew stronger. Red Hollow Ranch was built by my granddaddy with nothing but a herd of cattle and a whole lot of hope. My daddy kept it alive through years of no rain and hard times. And I'll be damned if I'm the Callaway that lets this place turn to dust. The men roared with approval, shouting and clapping, promising they were in it with him. Clara stood off to the side, just watching, feeling like something inside her was breaking and mending all at once. Ethan found her after the crowd thinned out. "I didn't mean to shine a light on you back there," he said. "You didn't? Sure felt like it." Clara turned to look him square in the eye. "You want to know what I'm running from? Only if you're wanting to tell me." The words spilled out of her before she could catch them. "I had a daughter. She passed when she was 3. Took a fever just like your wife. I couldn't do a thing to save her. All I could do was watch her slip away." Clara's voice cracked. "After she was gone, I couldn't settle down nowhere. I couldn't build a life, 'cause everything I ever built just crumbled. Everyone I ever loved was gone. So I just kept on moving, kept on cooking, kept paying off debts that weren't mine, because that was a whole lot easier than admitting I was just running from the pain." Ethan didn't say a word, didn't offer any of those empty comforts. He just pulled her into a tight embrace and let her cry into his shirt until there were no more tears left. "I'm so sorry," she finally whispered. "Don't you be sorry for grieving. I am sorry for not telling the truth, for making out like I was just here to settle a score, when the fact is I was here because I didn't have anywhere else on earth to go." "Well, you are here now. That is all that matters." Clara leaned back, drying her face with her sleeve. "I don't know how to stay, Ethan. I don't know how to put something together and believe it will not just fall to pieces." "Me neither. But maybe that is something we can figure out side by side." "What if I can't do it? What if I cannot save this ranch?" "You already have. Now we just have to work to keep it breathing." Clara looked up toward the little chapel, then down at the ranch spread out before them, and out at the men working in the distance. "All right," she said. "All right, I will stay. Not for a week, not for some debt, but because I want to." She met his gaze. "Because maybe it is about time I stopped running." A real smile spread across Ethan's face, the first honest-to-goodness smile she had ever seen on him. "Then let us get to work." They walked back down that hill together. Just two people who had been carrying way too much sorrow, finally learning how to carry something a little lighter, hope. The first real test showed up 2 weeks later when the bank sent a man out. His name was Gerald Pritchard, and he rode up in a buggy that was far too clean for a ranch road, wearing a suit that was too fancy for a man who did real work. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Ethan went out to meet him, his shoulders squared up and his jaw tight. "This ain't gonna be good," Charlie mumbled next to her. "How can you tell?" "Because banks don't send fellas in expensive suits to bring you good news." Clara dried her hands on her apron and started for the door. "Where do you think you're going?" Charlie called out. to hear what the man has to say. This business involves every last one of us." She got to the porch just as Pritchard was pulling a stack of papers from his leather case. "Mr. Calloway, I regret to inform you that the bank's position has not altered. We require payment in full by March 15th, or we will have no choice but to foreclose." "That is 4 months from now," Ethan said. "I told your boss I am working on it." "Working on it is not a payment arrangement." Pritchard shot a look at Clara, then turned back to Ethan. "I see you have hired on more help. That is a curious decision for a ranch that claims to be in financial trouble." "She is not more help, she is—" "I am an investment," Clara interrupted, stepping down from the porch. "Mr. Calloway brought me on to straighten out the operations and cut down our costs. We have already found $1,200 in funds we can get back and have slashed our monthly spending by 30%. Pritchard's eyebrows shot up. "Is that a fact?" "It is a fact, and we are putting new ways of working into place that will raise our profit margins by the spring." Clara folded her arms across her chest. "So, unless your bank wants to foreclose on a ranch that is about to start making good money, I would suggest you give us the time we are asking for." Pritchard sized her up. "And who might you be exactly?" "I am someone who knows that numbers do not lie, but banks sure do." Clara held his stare. "Your bank has been overcharging Mr. Calloway on his interest for the last 3 years. We have the papers to prove it. We also have proof of some mighty suspicious tax assessments. So this is what is going to happen. You are going to take our payment plan back to your boss, and you are going to suggest he accepts it. Because if you do not, we will be filing complaints with the State Banking Commission about your predatory lending practices." All the color washed out of Pritchard's face. "That is a very serious accusation." "This is a very serious situation." Clara took another step toward him. "We are not asking for a handout. We are asking to be treated fair. Can you give us that, or should I start writing my letters to Austin?" Pritchard snapped his briefcase shut. "I will pass along your proposal to my superiors." "You do that, and Mr. Pritchard." Clara gave him a smile that had no warmth in it. "Next time you decide to visit, come hungry. I will see to it you get a proper meal. It might just help you remember that we are people, not just figures on your balance sheet." He took off in a cloud of dust and hurt feelings. Ethan just stared at Clara. What in the world just happened? I called his bluff. Banks cannot stand being looked at too closely. They hate it even more than they love money. She turned to go back inside. "He will be back with a better offer inside of a week." "How do you know that?" "Because I know men like him. They are all hat and no cattle. They go after folks who do not push back." Clara stopped in the doorway. "But we are pushing back now." Charlie was grinning from ear to ear when she walked into the kitchen. Now that was something to see. "That was foolish," Clara corrected him. "I just stood up to a banker. He could make our lives a living hell. Or he could give us exactly what we need." Charlie's grin got even wider. "Either way, getting to watch you stare that man down was worth the risk." 3 days later, a telegram came. It offered new terms, a lower interest rate, a new payment deadline pushed back to June, and a formal apology for the errors on the tax assessment. Ethan had to read it 2 times. "You were right." "I am usually right. People just have a hard time listening." Clara took the telegram from him. "But this just buys us some time. We still have to make some money." "I have been thinking on that." Ethan spread out a map. "There is a big cattle drive getting started in Wichita Falls next month. A huge outfit heading up to the railheads in Kansas. They are paying top dollar for good drovers and quality beef." "How much?" "Enough to make a difference. To make maybe $2,000 if we send up our best stock and I go along with them." A knot formed in Clara's stomach. "You are going on the drive?" "I have to. They will not pay the highest price unless the owner is there to stand by his cattle." "How long will you be gone?" 6 weeks, could be 8, all depends on the weather." That is 2 months. I know. Ethan looked her right in the eyes. But it is our best chance at some real money before spring comes. Clara wanted to fight him on it, wanted to say it was too dangerous, too long, just too much of a gamble. But she knew Ranchin well enough to know better. Sometimes you had to risk it all just to save a piece of it. Then we had better get you ready, she said. What do you need? The next 3 weeks were pure chaos. Ethan and Frank picked out 40 head of their best cattle. Miguel and Pete mended saddles and fixed tack. Tommy and the younger hands spent their days practicing their roping and branding. Clara cooked meals big enough to fatten up men who would be living on dried meat and hard biscuits for 2 solid months. She also made plans. While you are away, I am going to rearrange the winter work, she told Ethan one night while they shared coffee. The cattle that are staying here need a better feeding schedule. I found a fella who will trade us hay for beef at a fair price. And Charlie mentioned a vegetable farmer over near Abilene who might want to partner with us for the spring planting. You're trying to build a farm on a cattle ranch. I'm trying to spread out where our money comes from. The price of cattle goes up and down. The price of food stays steady. If we can grow vegetables for the towns around here, we can create a regular income that does not depend on the whims of the market. Ethan just shook his head, amazed. Where did you learn about business? From watching men lose everything they had by betting it all on one crop or one mine or one cattle season. Clara poured more coffee into his cup. My father lost 3 fortunes by gambling on things he thought were sure things. I learned you never ever put all your eggs into one basket. Did your father teach you that? No, his failures did. The night before the men were set to leave, Clara could not sleep a wink. She stood on the porch watching the bunkhouse where Ethan and the drovers were getting their gear together, and her chest felt tight with a feeling she could not put a name to. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was something worse. He is going to be all right. She turned and saw Frank standing beside her, his arm finally out of its sling. I know, Clara said. Then why do you look like you are on your way to a funeral? Because 2 months is a long time. A whole lot can happen. Frank lit a cigarette. A whole lot can happen in 2 minutes. You cannot live your life afraid of what might come. That is easy for you to say. Is it now? Frank blew out a stream of smoke. I spent 15 years being scared of everything. After my wife up and left, I was scared to trust, scared to have hope, scared to care about a single thing, because caring meant you were just asking to get hurt. He looked straight at her. Then you showed up and scared me more than ever. You know why? Why? Because you made me remember what I was missing. You made me remember that being scared all the time is not really living at all. Frank flicked his cigarette ash into the dirt. The boss is coming back, Clara. And when he does, you two are going to have to sort out what this thing between you really is. There is no thing. You keep telling yourself that. He left her out there alone with the stars, and a truth she was not ready to look at. The morning came on way too fast. The drovers gathered in the main yard. Ethan, Frank, Miguel, and 2 extra hands from a neighbor's ranch. 40 head of cattle shuffled around in the holding pen, ready for the long journey north. Clara brought out hot coffee and fresh-baked bread, watching as Ethan checked over his saddle for the 3rd time. You got everything you need? She asked. I think so. Your money belt? Got it. Extra socks, medicine in case someone gets banged up. Yes, Mother, Ethan said with a small smile. We will be fine. You had better be. I did not turn this whole ranch upside down just for you to get yourself killed on. A cattle drive. I would not dream of it. They just stood there, neither one of them knowing what to say next. Finally, Ethan pulled something small out of his pocket. I found this in my wife's things. I thought you might want it. It was a recipe card with handwritten words in faded ink. Peach cobbler, Sarah Calloway's original recipe. A lump formed in Clara's throat. I cannot take this. Yes, you can. She would want someone to use it, someone who cares about feeding people the way she did. Ethan pressed the card into her hand. Keep the ranch running while I am away. Keep the men fed and keep them focused. And Clara? Yeah? Do not run. Promise me you will not run." Clara looked down at the recipe card, then at this man who had somehow become as necessary to her as breathing, then at the ranch that had stopped feeling like a place to work and started feeling like home. "I promise," she whispered. Ethan swung up onto his horse. The drovers moved out, the cattle followed behind them, and dust began to rise. Clara stood in the yard, watching until they were just a speck on the horizon, clutching a dead woman's recipe and wondering when she had started caring so much that it hurt. "Well," Charlie said from behind her, "guess it is just us now." "I guess so. You're really planning on staying?" Clara folded the recipe card with great care. "I made a promise, did I not? Promises are easy to make. Keeping them is the hard part. Then I guess we will all find out just what I am made of." The first week without Ethan felt strange. The ranch seemed emptier, quieter, like something essential had been taken away. Clara threw herself into her work, cooking, planning, organizing, and pushing the men who stayed behind to keep up standards, even though they were short-handed. She started a small garden behind the cookhouse using seeds she had ordered from a catalog. She convinced Charlie to help her build cold frames so they could have winter vegetables. She negotiated a deal with the farmer in Abilene to trade some of their beef for seed stock and equipment. The men watched her transform with something that looked like awe. "She is like a general," Tommy said one evening, planning out campaigns and strategies. "She is like someone who has finally stopped running," Charlie corrected him. On the 10th day, a woman arrived. She came in a hired buggy, dressed head to toe in black, with a face so stern it looked like it was chipped from granite. Clara was out in her garden when Charlie called her over. "This here is Mrs. Victoria Ashford," he said, his voice careful. "A woman came to see you." She looked Clara up and down with eyes that saw everything. "So you are the cook that has everyone talking. I am Victoria Ashford. Can I be of service to you?" "Maybe." "The ranch right next to Red Hollow is mine. 3,000 acres, which is double the size of the Callaway property." Victoria's smile was all business. It never touched her eyes. "I have an offer to make. I am not the owner, ma'am. Mr. Callaway is away on a cattle drive. He will not be back for 6 weeks. I know that, and that is why I am talking to you." Victoria presented a piece of paper. "I will pay $8,000 in cash for Red Hollow Ranch today." Clara felt her heart stop beating. "That amount will not even pay off his debts. It is enough for him to get out without owing anything. The bank would take a smaller payment if it means they can release the property. Mr. Callaway could have a fresh start someplace new. This place is his home. This place is a failing ranch that is pulling him under." Victoria's voice became a little gentler. "I am not trying to pull a fast one on him, Miss Whitmore. I am giving him a way out before he loses it all. What about the ranch hands? What will happen to all of them? I would probably keep most of them on. It is hard to find good workers." Clara stared at the paper, at the number that stood for everything Ethan had worked for, everything his family had poured their lives into. $8,000. It was not enough. It would never be enough. "I cannot accept this for him," Clara said with purpose, "but I will make certain he receives your offer as soon as he is back. Do not take too much time. This offer is only good for 30 days. Victoria got back into her carriage. "And Miss Whitmore, whatever it is you believe you are creating here, it is not going to survive. This ranch is finished. You are just too bullheaded to accept it." She rode off, leaving Clara with a piece of paper that could fix everything or ruin it completely. That evening, she called everyone together. All the hands that were left gathered in the main dining hall. Charlie, Tommy, Pete, and the other 6 men. Clara explained the whole mess in plain terms. The offer, the time limit, the decision they had to make. "We could just tell Ethan to sell it," she explained. "Just leave. Begin again somewhere else." Or, Tommy piped up, "or we could prove that Victoria Ashford is wrong. We can make this ranch profitable again before Ethan even returns. We can show him that this place is worth fighting for." Charlie leaned back in his chair. And just how are we supposed to do that in only 6 weeks? By working harder than we ever have in our lives. By using every single clever idea we have talked about. By getting that vegetable garden partnership going and making some money before the spring comes. Clara looked every man in the eye. By making a choice that Red Hollow Ranch is worth saving. I am in, Tommy said without a second thought. Me too, Pete chimed in. One after another, all the men agreed. Charlie was the last one. You realize this probably will not work. I know. You realize Ethan might get back and just decide to sell the place anyway. I know that too. So why are we even fighting? Clara thought of the recipe card in her pocket, of the look in Ethan's eyes when he made her promise she would not leave, of how this place had started to feel like home without her even noticing. Because some things are worth the fight, even when you are afraid, even when it looks like you cannot win, and even when it would be so much easier to give up. She stood up tall. So we fight, and we do not quit until we have won or there is nothing left to fight for. The room erupted with shouts of agreement, and Clara Whitmore, who had spent 10 years running away from anything that meant something, finally dug in her heels and made her stand. The next 6 weeks were pure misery. They toiled from before sunup to after sundown, and sometimes even longer. They planted vegetables in the frozen dirt using tricks Miguel's grandmother had passed down. They constructed a smokehouse to cure meat they could sell. They signed deals with 3 different towns to deliver food on a regular basis. And they even started a small dairy with 4 cows that nobody thought were good for anything. Clara cooked meals, she organized supplies, she made plans, and she kept everyone going. The men complained, but they kept on working. A little bit of money started to come in, just a trickle at first, but it was steady. Victoria Ashford sent over 2 more offers, and each one was for more money. Clara threw them in the fire without even reading past the first sentence. You have lost your mind, Charlie told her after the 3rd offer arrived. Probably. What happens if we fail? Then we fail while we are trying. That is a whole lot more than we were doing before. 4 weeks into their plan, everything went wrong. The dairy cows ate some bad feed and 2 of them died. The vegetable garden was in danger from a surprise frost. One of their biggest delivery deals was canceled when the customer found someone cheaper. Clara was in the kitchen at midnight trying to make the numbers work, but they just would not, and she felt that old, powerful need to just run away. Just pack a bag, disappear, and let somebody else clean up the mess. But then she thought of her promise. She thought of Ethan's face when he asked her to stay, and she thought of her daughter's little grave that she had abandoned because running away was less painful than remembering. No, she said out loud to the quiet kitchen. Not again. She took out Sarah Calloway's recipe card and read the worn handwriting. 3 cups of peaches, 1 cup of sugar. Butter, cinnamon, love. Love. Sarah had actually written that down. Love as one of the ingredients. Clara started laughing, and then she started crying, and then she went right back to work. The very next day, she talked Charlie into butchering one of their older steers so they could make beef jerky to sell. She talked Pete into showing her how to work with leather so they could fix up and sell old tack. She talked Tommy into breaking horses for the ranches nearby, to branch out, to adjust, to stay alive. By the 5th week, they had earned $1,700. It was not enough to save the ranch by itself, but when they added it to what Ethan would bring home from the drive, maybe, just maybe. On the first day of the 6th week, Clara was in the kitchen long before the sun came up, her hands working the biscuit dough while her eyes stayed fixed on the road. Any day now, she thought, Ethan would be riding home. Any day now, she would have to tell him about Victoria's offers, about the money they had scraped together, about the hard choices sitting on their doorstep. Any day now, she would have to look him in the eye and figure out what this thing between them truly was. The kitchen door creaked open. Clara turned, flour dusting her hands, a knot of hope tightening in her throat. But it was not Ethan. It was a telegram. Charlie stood in the doorway, his face pale as a ghost, holding that piece of paper like it was a coiled snake. "What is it?" Clara asked. But a sudden chill in the air told her she already knew the answer. "There was an accident," Charlie said, his voice cracking. "A stampede just outside Dodge City. 3 men are hurt, and 2 are dead." Clara felt all the air leave her lungs. "Ethan, the telegram." "It does not say who, just that there are casualties and the drive is held up." Charlie's hand was shaking. "It says they will send more news when they can." The ball of biscuit dough slid from Clara's fingers and hit the wooden floor with a soft thud. She just stood there, frozen, as her whole world started to spin. Everything she had fought for, every promise she had kept, every sliver of hope she had allowed herself to feel, was now hanging on by a thread, waiting on a telegram that said far too little. Just then Tommy came bursting through the door. "Is it true about the drive?" he asked. "We don't know a thing for certain yet," Charlie answered. But his voice had no fight in it. Clara found her own voice then. "Saddle a horse." Charlie looked at her. "What?" "Saddle a horse," she repeated. "I am riding to Dodge City. That is a hard 3-day ride. You will kill yourself." "Then I will die trying," Clara said, untying her apron. "I am not going to sit here and wonder if he is alive or dead. I am not running this time. This time, I am fighting." She grabbed her coat and marched toward the door. Behind her, Charlie called out, "What should we tell the men?" Clara stopped and turned back to face him. "Tell them the truth. Tell them we do not know anything for sure. And tell them we keep on working until we hear different." Her voice grew hard as iron. "And you tell them that Red Hollow Ranch does not quit. Not for any banks, not for any neighbors, and not for death itself." With that, she walked out into the cold morning air, toward the barn, toward the horse that would carry her to answers, and toward the one truth she had been running from for her entire life. She finally understood that love meant you had to risk losing everything, and she was finally ready to put it all on the line. Clara rode for 3 days, only stopping when the horse absolutely needed rest. By the time she finally laid eyes on Dodge City, her hands were covered in blisters, and her eyes burned from the dust, the lack of sleep, and the fear. The stockyard looked like its own sprawling town, with pens overflowing with cattle and drovers kicking up dust everywhere. The whole place smelled of animals and money. She swung a leg over the saddle and her feet hit the ground, her knees threatening to buckle. She grabbed the first cowboy she saw. "The stampede," she said. "Where are the men who survived?" He pointed a shaky finger toward a building on the edge of the yards. "The doctor has them in there, ma'am, but you do not want to go in." Clara was already running. The building was 1 part hospital and 2 parts pure chaos. Injured men were laid out on cots, a doctor was barking orders, and the air was thick with the smell of blood and carbolic acid. She searched the room, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she could hear it. Frank Delaney was sitting in a corner, his arm wrapped in fresh bandages, his face a mask of pain. Miguel was on a cot, breathing but not conscious. But there was no Ethan. Clara's world narrowed to a pinhole. "Frank, where is he?" Frank looked up at her, and the look on his face told her everything she needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "He is alive." The wave of relief was so strong it almost brought her to her knees. "But he is bad, Clara. He is real bad." She found him in a small room in the back. He was all alone except for a nurse who was changing the bandages on his chest. His shirt was gone. His whole chest was wrapped in white cloth that was already stained with red. His face was so pale he might have been dead, but for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The nurse looked up. "Are you family?" "Close enough," Clara said, moving to his bedside. "What happened?" "The herd spooked from a lightning strike. The cattle just ran over anything in their path. He was trying to turn them. His horse got shot out from under him. He went down hard. Took a hoof to the ribs, probably broke a few. He got trampled pretty bad. Lost a lot of blood before we could get to him." "Will he live?" The nurse paused for a moment. Maybe, if infection does not take hold. If his lungs do not fill up with fluid. If he has the strength to fight. He has the strength, Clara declared, taking Ethan's hand in hers. It was cold. He is the strongest man I have ever known. The nurse gave them some privacy. Clara sat by that bed, held his hand, and whispered all the things she had never been brave enough to say out loud. She made promises and confessions, and she sent prayers up to a God she was not even sure was listening. Hours crawled by. Frank finally came into the room. The drive boss says we got the herd through. Sold them for a good price. Should be about $3,000 after all the expenses are paid. I do not care about the money, Clara said. You ought to, Frank replied, sitting down heavily. It is what he nearly gave his life for. He took a deep breath. He was trying to save a kid. The youngest drover on the crew got thrown from his horse when the stampede hit. Ethan went back in for him. That is why he was right in the path of it all. That is why he went down. Did the boy make it? She asked. Yep. Walked away with nothing but bruises. Ethan here took the hit that was meant for him. Frank's voice broke. Always the hero. Always thinking about everybody else. Never thinking about himself. Clara gave Ethan's hand a squeeze. Wake up, you stubborn fool. Wake up and tell me what happened yourself. Do not you dare make me sit here and guess. There was nothing. Only the sound of his shallow breathing and the sharp smell of blood and medicine. Frank got to his feet. I'm headed back to the ranch with Miguel tomorrow. Somebody has to tell the men what is going on. Are you staying? For as long as it takes, she said. What about the ranch? Charlie can handle it. The men can handle it. They have been handling it without me for 3 days now. Clara met Frank's gaze, her own unwavering. I am not leaving him. What if he does not wake up? Then I will be right here when he dies, she said. But I am betting on him waking up. Frank left, and Clara was alone again with Ethan and the quiet. She talked to him all through the night. She told him about the ranch, about the money they had earned, about Victoria Ashford's offers. She told him about her garden and the dairy and the good deal she had struck. She told him how loyal the men were, about Tommy's silly bet, and about Charlie's quiet wisdom. And then she told him about her daughter, about the guilt she had carried for 10 long years. She told him how she had blamed herself for not being able to save her baby girl, and how that blame made her run, because staying put meant facing the hard truth that some things just cannot be saved, no matter how hard you fight for them. But I am done running, she whispered to him. Even if you do not make it through this, even if I lose you too, I am staying at Red Hollow. I am fighting for that ranch because it is worth fighting for. Because our men are worth it. Because you taught me that some things are more important than just protecting yourself from getting hurt. His hand twitched in hers. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Ethan? His eyes fluttered open, slow and confused. Clara? I am here, she said. You rode all the way to Dodge City? A hard 3-day ride, she confirmed. Nearly killed the horse and myself both. That is stupid, he breathed. Yeah, well, I learned from the best, she said, pressing his hand to her cheek. How do you feel? Like I got trampled by about 40 head of cattle. That is because you did, she told him. Ethan tried to smile, but winced in pain instead. The kid, Tommy's cousin, is he alive? He is, thanks to you. The cattle sold, $3,000. That is good. No, she said. It is not good enough. It is not worth your life. Ethan's eyes finally focused on her face. You have been crying. No, I have not. Your eyes are all red. That is just dust from the ride. Clara, she finally broke. Yes, I have been crying, she admitted. I thought you were dead. I thought I had lost you before I ever got the chance to tell you. She trailed off. Tell me what? Clara looked at this man, the one who had pulled her from a ruined wagon, who had given her a second chance, who had trusted her with his home, and who had made her promise she would not run away. This man who had almost died to save a boy he barely knew. This stubborn, loyal, impossibly good man who had somehow become the one reason she had finally stopped running. "To tell you that I love you," she said, plain and simple. "That I am so tired of pretending that I do not. That I want to stay at Red Hollow, not because I owe you a thing, but because I cannot imagine being anywhere else, or with anyone else." Ethan's eyes started to well up. "You love me?" "I love you, and it scares me to death. But I am done letting fear make my choices for me." "I love you too," he whispered. "I have since the day you threatened to cut my coat off me when I was half frozen." Clara laughed through her tears. "That is when you knew?" "That is when I finally admitted it to myself," he said. "But I have been falling for you since that first night you cooked supper." He squeezed her hand. "Do not leave." "I am not leaving," she said. "Not now. Not ever. Promise?" "I promise." They stayed just like that, with their hands clasped and their foreheads touching, breathing in sync, until the doctor came back in and kicked Clara out so Ethan could get some real rest. His recovery took 2 long weeks. For 2 weeks, Clara stayed in a boarding house close to the stockyards. She visited Ethan twice a day and watched as he slowly, stubbornly started to heal. Miguel got better faster and was released after just a week. Frank's arm had to be reset, but it was mending just fine. The money from the cattle drive was wired to the bank back in Red Hollow. Clara sent telegrams to Charlie, keeping him updated. "Ethan is alive. He is healing. We are coming home soon." Charlie sent telegrams back. "Ranch is running smooth. Money is coming in steady. Victoria Ashford made another offer. The men said to tell that woman to go to hell." Clara could not help but smile when she read that one. On the 15th day, the doctor finally cleared Ethan for travel. "You take it slow now," he warned. "Those ribs are not all the way healed. You strain them, and you will be right back in here, or worse, dead. Do you understand?" "Understood," Ethan said. "I mean it, Calloway. Your woman here tells me you are a stubborn man, but even a stubborn man can end up dead if he is being a fool." Ethan glanced over at Clara. "My woman?" Clara could feel her face getting hot. "I might have said something like that when I introduced myself." "Good." Ethan pushed himself up slowly. "Because that is exactly what you are, if you will have me. I already told you I would. I mean, for real, with a preacher and promises and all the things that make it official." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan Calloway, are you asking me to marry you right here in a doctor's office in Dodge City? Would you rather I waited until we got back home? I would rather you did not die before you could ask me the right way." "Well then, I will ask you the right way when we make it back to Red Hollow, but you should know this, Clara Whitmore. I am going to marry you just as soon as I can stand up straight without my ribs screaming, as soon as we save the ranch. As soon as you say yes, yes. I have not even asked you yet. You just told me you were going to. I am saying yes right now before you get yourself trampled on again and I miss my chance." Ethan wrapped his arms around her gently, careful not to hurt himself. "We are getting married. We are getting married, and we are staying at Red Hollow and staying at Red Hollow together." The journey home took 5 long days, mainly because Ethan was too banged up for a hard ride. They rolled along in a wagon Clara had rented, moving slow, talking about everything and then some. They talked about how they would pool the cattle drive money with Clara's earnings to finally pay the bank. They made plans to get the vegetable garden bigger and better come springtime. They dreamed about rebuilding the ranch into something that would last, something that did not rise and fall with cattle prices alone. And they talked about getting married in the little chapel on the hill, the same one where Ethan's parents had said their vows, where he had buried his first wife, a place where new starts grew right alongside old endings. "Sarah would have taken a shine to you," Ethan said on the 3rd day. "She would have loved that you used her recipe, that you are looking after the men just like she always did. I am not trying to replace her. I know you are not replacing anyone, you are Clara, and that is more than enough." When Red Hollow Ranch finally appeared on the afternoon of the 5th day, Clara started crying all over again. The whole place looked different. It was not just clean or tidy, it felt alive. Cowboys were out working in the fields. Smoke was curling up from the cookhouse. New fences stood strong, buildings were patched up, and a garden had somehow made it through the frost. And there, waiting in the yard, were all 16 men. Charlie, Tommy, Pete, Miguel, Frank, even the hands they had borrowed who had decided to stay on and help. They let out a huge cheer when the wagon pulled in. "The boss is home," Tommy hollered. "And he brought Clara back with him," another man shouted. Ethan climbed down from the wagon, slow and careful, wincing a bit. The men rushed over to him, gentle so as not to hurt him, but needing to put a hand on his shoulder just to be sure he was real and breathing. Clara hung back, just watching, until Charlie pulled her into a big, rough hug. "You did good, girl. Real good. We all did good. Nah, you did good. We just did what you told us to." The party went on long into the night. Clara cooked, of course she did. She whipped up a feast from the supplies she had left and the new stock the men had bought. There was fried chicken and cornbread, a hearty stew, and a cobbler made from Sarah's recipe. The men ate like they had been starving for a month. Even though Clara knew Charlie had kept them well fed, this was not really about the food. It was about them all being together again, about making it through, about knowing they had all fought for something and had come out on top. After supper, Ethan got to his feet carefully and cleared his throat. "I have got a few things to say." The room fell silent. "First off, the drive money, plus what Clara and the men made while I was gone, comes to about $5,000. Now, that is not enough to clear the debt with the bank. But it is enough to get us a new deal on the loan. We are not out of the woods, but we are not 6 feet under either." The men all nodded. "Second, Frank, Miguel, you two nearly cashed in your chips. You are getting bonuses. It is not much, but it is something." Frank just shook his head. "Do not need a bonus, boss. Just need to know we have got a place here." "You have got a place? All of you, for as long as you want one." Ethan took a breath. "Which leads me to my third point. I am making this ranch a partnership. Not on some legal paper, but in spirit. What we build from here on out, we build together. What we earn, we are gonna share. This is not just my ranch anymore. It is ours." A wave of surprise went through the room. "Boss, you cannot do that," Tommy started to say. "I can, and I am. This place only works if we all give a damn about it, if we all fight for it. Y'all proved that while I was gone. So are we going to do this together, or not at all?" Charlie lifted his coffee cup. "To Red Hollow." "To Red Hollow," the men all echoed. Ethan held up a hand. "One last thing. Clara and I are getting married." The room absolutely erupted. Men were whooping and hollering, slapping the tables and demanding all the details. Clara felt herself getting pulled into hugs and handshakes, with folks congratulating her until she felt overwhelmed in the most perfect way. "So, when is the big day?" Pete called out. "As soon as the preacher can ride out here," Ethan answered. "Or as soon as Ethan can stand up without toppling over," Clara added with a smile. "Or as soon as Clara stops being so stubborn about letting me stand on my own 2 feet. So same thing then. Never." Laughter filled the dining room, sounding like the prettiest music. Later, after the men had all gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was all clean and the fire was low, Clara and Ethan sat out on the porch just watching the stars. "You really want to marry me?" Clara asked softly. "More than I have wanted anything in a long, long time. Even though I am so difficult. Especially because you are difficult. Easy women are boring." Clara laughed. "What about the ranch? What if we cannot save it?" "Then we will have tried to save it together. That is a whole lot more than I had before you walked up my drive." Ethan took her hand in his. "But we are going to save it. I know we will." "How can you know that?" "Because you are too darn stubborn to let it fail. and I am too stubborn to let you down." 3 weeks later, they were married in the chapel on the hill. Charlie was the one who gave Clara away. Frank stood up there as Ethan's best man. The preacher from town came out to do the ceremony. All 16 cowboys were there, all scrubbed clean and looking almost respectable. Clara wore a simple dress she had made herself. Ethan wore his best suit, his ribs still wrapped up tight but on the mend. When the preacher asked if she took this man, Clara said, "I do," without a single hesitation. When he asked Ethan the same question, Ethan's voice came out strong and sure. "I do." They kissed while the cowboys cheered and whistled, and afterward they had a feast, because that is just what you do. Clara had spent 2 whole days cooking every single thing she knew how to make. The tables were groaning under the weight of all that food. The men ate until they could barely move. Somebody found a fiddle, and soon there was dancing, singing, and more joy than that old ranch had seen in years. As the sun started to set, Ethan pulled Clara to the side. "Happy?" "Terrified, but happy." "Good terrified or bad terrified?" "Good terrified. The kind that tells me I finally care about something enough to be scared of losing it." Ethan kissed her on the forehead. "You are not losing this. You are not losing me. We are building something that is gonna last. Promise?" "Promise." That first year was hard. They paid down a good chunk of the bank loan, but they did not clear it. They built the vegetable operation into a business that made money, but it did not make them wealthy. They lost a few cattle to the winter cold and a dry spell, but not enough to break them. They made mistakes, and they fixed them, and they learned. Clara cooked and managed the books and made the plans. Ethan led the men and worked hard and learned to trust. The men stayed loyal, the ranch survived. By the second year, they were making a profit. Not rich, mind you, but stable. The bank stopped sniffing around. Victoria Ashford stopped sending letters with offers. The cattle market started to look up, and by the third year, Clara was pregnant. She stood in the very kitchen she had first scrubbed down 3 years ago with a hand on her growing belly and felt fear and hope all mixed up inside her. "What if something happens?" she asked Ethan one night. "But what if nothing happens? What if everything goes just right?" "That is not how life works." "No, but it is how faith works, and you are the one who taught me that." Ethan knelt down beside her. "You taught me that caring about something means you are risking pain, that staying put means you have to face your fears, that building something good requires believing it will not all come crashing down. I am scared." "Me too. But we are scared together, and that makes it bearable." Their daughter was born in the spring, a healthy, strong little thing with her mother's grit and her father's stubborn streak. They named her Sarah Grace, for Ethan's first wife, who had taught him how to love, for Clara's first daughter, who had taught her what it meant to lose, and for the grace that had somehow brought the two of them together. Clara held her baby in the kitchen, where it had all begun, and felt like the circle was finally complete. She had come to Red Hollow because she owed a debt. She had stayed because she made a promise. She had built a home because she had found love. And now she held the future in her arms, a future she had been too scared to even dream of. "Thank you," she whispered to the little baby sleeping in her arms. "For what?" Ethan asked from the doorway. "For being alive, for being here, for giving me a reason to keep on fighting." Ethan walked over to them and wrapped his arms around his wife and his daughter. "We all keep fighting. That is what a family does." Outside, the ranch was breathing with the steady rhythm of work and life and purpose. You could hear the cowboys laughing, the cattle lowing, the chickens clucking. You could see the garden growing, and the future was unfolding right before their eyes. Red Hollow Ranch had been on its last leg when Clara Whitmore showed up with nothing but a carpet bag and a whole lot of determination. It had been saved by fried chicken and stubbornness and love. But more than that, it had been saved by people who decided that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible, worth staying for even when running away looked a whole lot easier, worth building even when it could all fall to pieces. And as Clara stood in that kitchen holding her daughter, Surrounded by the life she had built from little more than flour and faith, she finally understood what home really meant. It was not a place you just find. It was a place you fight for, a place you earn, a place you refuse to give up on, no matter how scared you might be. And Red Hollow Ranch, with its brand new kitchen, its crew of loyal men, its stubborn owner, and its cook who had finally learned how to stay, was finally, completely, and truly home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.